Hey guys, today we're going to learn how to find the midpoint or even use the midpoint formula. So we have a couple vocabulary words that we have to talk about. The first one being midpoint. So what is exactly a midpoint? Well, a midpoint is a point on a line that divides it into two equal parts. Okay, so if we have a line and with a point B on the end and a point A on the other end, so that's actually a line segment. And let's say the length of AB is 10 units. Now, if we were to put a point right in the middle, calling that the midpoint, well, that divides the whole segment AB into two equal parts. Those two purple tick marks represents that these two segments AM and MB are congruent, which means that they're the same length. So if the whole segment is 10 and we put a midpoint right in the middle, midpoint, then we have two congruent segments or two congruent parts. So if these are two congruent lengths, AM and MB, what do you think the lengths are? That's right, 5. Good work. Alright, so we just talked about what a segment was, and a segment is if you have a line and you have 2 points on the end of the line, that's considered a line segment. Now a segment bisector, let's talk about that. A segment bisector can be a ray, a line, point, or even a plane that divides a segment in half. This should be that. Let's fix that right now. That's perfect. Alright. So we're talking about a segment bisector being a ray, a line, point, or a plane, but we're going to only focus on ray, line, and point for now. So an example of a segment bisector, let's draw a segment, and we know that this point right here is in the middle, which will give us two congruent segments. This would be called a midpoint. So that's a bisector, that's actually a point. The second example, we'll draw a segment again, and if we have just a part of a line going straight up from the middle, that would be a ray. So this would be a segment bisector that's a ray. Okay, so the last one, if we have a segment again, and we have something that bisects it all the way through with two arrowheads on each end, that would be a line. So then basically these are all three examples of segment bisectors because they're bisecting a segment. Alright, example 1, we have to find the segment lengths. So our directions are asking us to find the length of segment RS. So with our diagram, let's observe. We have a segment RS, and we have a segment going through its segment RS, VW. And if you look at it, this segment is actually passing right through the midpoint T, and we know that the midpoint is T because these two tick marks indicate that these are two congruent parts. And we know that a midpoint divides a segment into two congruent parts. So that being said, because RT is 21.7, and we know that the tick marks mean that they're the same length, TS is also 21.7. So RT is congruent, and this is a symbol that means congruent, not equals, but we're talking about the length, so it's an equal sign with a little squiggly line on top. The segment RT is congruent to TS. Okay, so we know that TS is 21.7 because they're the same length, and if we have to find the length of RS, all we have to do is take RT, add that to TS, and that'll give us the entire length of RS. So substitute in your lengths, 21.7 plus 21.7, that'll give us the length of RS, and then we add them together, we get 43.4 to be the length of RS. Okay, so this problem can be difficult if you do not know what you're looking at exactly. So again, these tick marks represent congruency, which means that they're the same measurement. When we know that T is the midpoint, because when we have VW intersect in the middle of RS, it produces two congruent parts. VW would be the segment bisector, RS is being bisected, RT and TS are two congruent parts. Alright, example 2, we have to find the length of KL. So looking at our diagram, JL is being bisected by the midpoint K. And how do we know that K is the midpoint? Good. we have two tick marks that represent that they're congruent. So JK and KL are the same measurement. But look, JK is represented by 8 minus 3x, and KL is represented by 2x plus 5. Well, how do we know if they're the same measurement? Well, we actually have to figure out the value of x that would make that equation true. Since JK is congruent to KL, we can set up an equation just like so. So 8 minus 3x is the same as 2x plus 5. So we have to think back in Algebra 1 and solve this equation. So we're going to add 3x to both sides to zero out the left-hand side. So we have 8, and then negative 3x plus 3x gives you 0, so we're not going to write anything down. Drop down the equal sign. 2x plus 3x, that'll give us 5x, and we still have plus 5. Now that we move the variables on one side of the equal sign, take the constants or the numbers that are on that same side as the variable and use the inverse operation to get it on the other side. So what do you think will make a plus 5 equal 0? Good, the inverse operation subtracting 5. So we take 5 and subtract it on both sides of the equal sign. 8 minus 5 is 3 equals 5x. And then you take the inverse operation of multiplying 5 and x together and you divide by 5. And you get 3/5 equals x. Alright, so since our value of x is 3/5, you might be thinking, well, this can't be right because it's not a clean integer. Well, our math is right, our equation's set up properly, 3/5 is right. So we still need to figure out the length of KL. We just found out what the value of x is. So we're going to take KL, 2x plus 5, and since we know the value of x is 3/5, we have to substitute in the 3/5 into x. So 2 times 3/5 plus 5, and then we're going to simplify 2 times 3/5 we get 1.2 plus 5. The length of KL ends up being 6.2. Alright, so let's use the midpoint formula now. Now what exactly is the midpoint? So let's draw a little coordinate plane here and draw a segment and connect them. Now the midpoint, let's say that this point right here is x sub 1 and y sub 1, and those little subscripts just indicates that this point is an xy, but then this is just like the first x and this is the first y, because we're going to have to identify another point here. So then those points would be x2 and y2. And again, the little subscript 2 is just a label, nothing significant other than the fact that you know that this is a different point than this one. A midpoint will be right in the middle of this segment. Okay, that's about halfway between x sub 1 and x sub 2, y sub 1, y sub 2. Okay, so in order to figure out what the midpoint is, if we add both x's together and divide it by 2, that'll give us the x coordinate of our midpoint. Okay, so we have our answer is going to be in actual coordinates, so this would represent the x coordinate of the midpoint, comma, now we got to figure out the y coordinate of the midpoint. If you add both y coordinates together and divide by 2, that'll give you the y coordinate of the midpoint. So together, your answer when it's asking for the midpoint should be an actual point. So notice how we pay close attention. We have parentheses. When you actually do the math here, it'll give you a number, comma, do the math here, it'll give you a number, parentheses. Okay, example 3, we have to use the midpoint formula. So we have to find the midpoint where the end of PR are P, which is negative 2, 5, and R is 4, 3. We need to find the coordinates of the midpoint. It is very, very important that you write down the midpoint formula and you substitute in everything 100% accurately. So the first thing we want to do is label our points. So for P, we're going to label that x sub 1 and 5 is y sub 1. So negative 2 is x sub 1, 5 is y sub 1. And R is going to be x sub 2, y sub 2. So our midpoint is going to be represented by a coordinate, and this is just labeling. It just means M is going to be a midpoint, X sub whatever the midpoint is, Y sub whatever the midpoint is. This just means this will represent our actual midpoint. So going back to our formula, to find the X coordinate of our midpoint, we take our X's and we add them together. So we have negative 2 plus 4 and then divide by 2. That'll give us our X coordinate of the midpoint when we simplify it out. Comma, Y sub 1, which is 5, plus Y sub 2, which is 3, and divide that by 2 as well. So we have a parentheses, x coordinate of our midpoint, comma, y coordinate of our midpoint, parentheses, which represents a point towards the end. So let's simplify further. We get 2 divided by 2, comma, 8 divided by 2, comma, parentheses. And then finally simplify further. We have 2 divided by 2 is 1, 8 divided by 2 is 4, and that's our midpoint. So our x sub m, our x coordinate of our midpoint, is 1, and our y coordinate of our midpoint is 4. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you guys are annotating and not just watching. Maybe you're doing Snapchat or Facebook, whatever the situation is. Make sure you are 100% focused on the video and you are listening intently. Also annotate on the sides if you have any questions, words that you didn't understand, vocabulary, diagrams, you didn't understand what they mean. Make sure you write them down so that I can or we can address that the next day.